Hello, welcome to Everything is Black or White Except Green Tech podcast. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Andrew Barron, who's a emeritus professor at Swansea University, former professor at Rice University, professor at Brunei University, and has specialisation in green technology and, in particular, energy security. So welcome, Andrew.
Hello, welcome. Thanks.
Yeah. So we should probably start off with your background and potentially the accent, because people might be asking about that.
That'll be the big guessing game. Everyone gets extra credit if they can work out where I was born. I actually came from the UK, grew up in the UK. I started out as a chemist, doing my degree and PhD at Imperial, and then moved to the States in 1986. To do a postdoc, which originally I was just going to do a postdoc and then come back to the UK, maybe a faculty position or something. My postdoc was at University of Texas in Austin, where Chris, you visited when we were for that Navy review. But I was only there for about 6 months, and then I got hired as a professor at Harvard University. And part of it was at the time I was doing main group chemistry, and that was a very hot topic in academia at the time. But when I got to Harvard, I started doing more materials and ended up doing nano before it was called nano, which was kind of weird at that time. And so in 95, I got hired away by Rice University in Houston. And of course, Rice was the university where C60 was discovered, and Rick Smalley and Bob Curl, the subsequently won the Nobel Prize for that. And the university, the president of the university, was very interested in creating a unique center, a new research center, the very first in the world on nanotechnology. So I was the first faculty hired to help set up that center and everything. So that's how I ended up there. And then over the years, I've been involved with the British consulate in Houston. I've been involved with helping the UK government. Through a series of connections and having started lots of companies, I was appointed as the Prince of Wales Visiting Innovator back in, I think when that was now, 2009. And one of my roles there was to look at all the startups and incubators and SMEs in Wales. And during that time, I interacted with the then Vice Chancellor and Pro Vice Chancellor here at Swansea, who were building a second campus or planning on building a second campus. And one of their areas of interest was energy and green energy and the environment. And so I wrote the proposal and created the idea for what is now ESRI, Energy Safety Research Institute, and got the funding from UK and Welsh governments and moved here to set that up. So that's kind of my potted history.
Yeah. So it's, as far as you've had quite a diverse portfolio, I suppose, of academic success, because you've worked in obviously the carbon nanotubes, there's hydrogen, and there's algae. And those who've watched the previous podcast will know that with Dan Jones, we talked about hydrogen, and part of it was dispelling some of the myths about hydrogen, and some of it was sort of drawing back on some of the expectations of hydrogen. I think a lot of stuff with green tech is people are thinking that there's a silver bullet, that one piece of technology will solve absolutely everything. And people think that hydrogen was going to be that, but it never materialized as such. But so people always think about green hydrogen-powered cars, which, with the way things have moved on with normal battery-powered EVs, probably not going to be the feature. However, what me and Dan did discuss was the ideas of hydrogen as energy storage, which I think is just overtaken hydro in some places in the world or pumped hydro. And also, we touched on the idea of hydrogen is brilliant for big plants. So if you are mining something and you need big diggers, and you have a source of water, put a big turbine next to it, turn your water into hydrogen, power your plants, and then recycle the water that comes back out, and you've got a pretty sustainable economy. So what's your opinion on where the hydrogen is going?
I think, first of all, getting back to sort of just green technology, I think there's a couple of problems. One is politicians is the answer to that problem. But politicians tend to have a very blinkered view of the world. And so if they're told something, they just repeat it again and again and again. And so if you ever say to the UK government, green electricity, they just say offshore wind. They don't say anything else. That's just the knee-jerk reaction. And that's the assumption that that's going to solve all the problems. And so that's true for transportation. EVs is the hot topic at the moment. And yes, everyone's got to have an EV. So one of the problems is that people tend to look at a single solution as opposed to looking at how do you use multiple solutions that work together. So how do you create an ecosystem? Having said that, one of the other things is then the press is the other big problem, is academics want to do some research and then say, oh, look, this is going to solve the world. It's going to, cure the planet of whatever it is, right? And it's only a piece of research, and there's years before it would ever get to the point where it could actually be used. But the press take that and immediately publish saying, hydrogen is the future of transport, hydrogen cars, hydrogen cars. And then, of course, when they don't quite work how they expect, or something else works a little different, everyone gets upset, and then, oh, hydrogen's never going to be used, or, and so suddenly you've got the sort of anti-effect of that. But I think hydrogen, as with EVs, as with, we'll call it sustainable fuels, as with other things, are all going to have a place in the future, because it turns out, I was actually having a conversation with someone yesterday who has an electric vehicle, and even though it's a very nice one, and it does okay mileage, and they charge at home, they still have problems when they have to do long journeys. There's still that range anxiety issue. So for some things, if you've got a car and you commute around town all day, electricity is fine. It's also fine if you've got somewhere to charge at home. But if you don't have somewhere to charge at home, that becomes a bit of a problem. So suddenly, electric EV is not your answer if you've got long journeys or you've got no charger in a flat or an apartment. So then hydrogen becomes more appropriate if you want a zero-emission vehicle, because in that case, you can refuel immediately. It takes about the same amount of time as a petrol car or diesel car. Range is not a problem. Because presumably you can refuel somewhere else and just keep refueling. The problem we've got at the moment is, and EV people have this as well, is if you count the number of petrol stations we have, even in Wales, I mean, it's in the thousands, right? Although I have driven through the middle of Wales late at night and trying to find a petrol station open when you're getting short of fuel is a little interesting, but you don't run out, But if you compare that to the number of EV charging points, and certainly if you compare that to the number of hydrogen refueling stations, it still is the infrastructure. And I think is kind of, you need to create the infrastructure to help. So your example for big diggers and at a mine, for example, hydrogen's the perfect fuel for them. And it's also the perfect fuel for things like taxis, forklift trucks at Amazon, for example. And the reason being is they run 24/7. Well, if you've got to charge for an hour at a time twice a day, that's 2 hours a day that forklift truck's not being used, which is 2 hours a day you having to have another forklift truck to replace the use of that forklift truck. So your CapEx goes up. Hydrogen, if you refuel and it takes a couple of minutes it would take a really short period of time for a forklift truck. If that hydrogen is also generated, we'll call it essentially free. It has to be, hydrogen also has a problem, is that it costs whatever the cost of the electricity is, or green hydrogen is. And if your electricity is expensive, then your hydrogen is expensive. But if you've got your own turbine or you've got your own solar, and once you've paid for that and it's generating excess electricity and use the excess to create hydrogen, now you're in a situation which makes sense. So I think the future of EVs and hydrogen, whether it's hydrogen fuel cells or hydrogen combustion, is, there are companies out doing both. There are companies who are trying to hedge their bets. And I think that in the long run, there will be applications for everything. It's just we need to make sure people understand there isn't one solution that fits everything. There never is.
Yeah, I think it's again this idea of people try to thinking about integration, like trying to. If you think about the complexities of a song, people will just sort of hum the melody. But if you ask them what other instruments we're playing, they won't be able to tell you. It's that way of people thinking is just like really single track minded.
Yeah.
But it's also dependent on geolocation as well. So Spain was in the BBC News yesterday because they have produced, and Germany as well, they're 55% on green electricity at the moment. Spain has been having a huge investment in things like solar panels. So there's a lot of excess energy. So they're starting to debate whether there's going to be some sort of issue in 10 years' time where they're actually going to be generating more electricity than they need. And that's where hydrogen also comes in. Where was it? There's an electric charge point somewhere in England, which they have a hydrogen plant running off a green source. It fills up their tank, and then they use that to power the EV charger.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really good energy storage. And
I think that's the thing, is that you don't necessarily use it as the transportation. You can, but you use it because it's a way of chemically storing things, and potential energy storing of things is very efficient, right? So if you make a chemical, that chemical doesn't go anywhere until you do something with it. So hydrogen, once you've made it, now it could leak, we'll get around that in a second, but once you make hydrogen, unless you use a fuel cell to go back to electricity and make water, or you burn it and make water, hydrogen will sit there forever. It just doesn't convert itself. In the same way that we have here in Wales, what's it called? Electricity Mountain or Power Mountain or whatever
with the two lakes which they pump water
right.
to, yeah.
It was built back in the 60s, I think, if I remember.
Is it Bala in North Wales, that place?
Yeah. And what they do there is, when electricity is cheap and excess in the middle of the night, they pump water up the top of a mountain, and it sits there in a lake on the top of the mountain, and then it just sits there. And it can sit there for years, and there's some evaporation, but basically its potential energy is always there. And then if in the middle of the day suddenly there's a massive need for electricity, they open the sluice gates, and suddenly by hydroelectric power they generate electricity. So they're not creating power; they're just turning it from cheap electricity into on-demand electricity. And hydrogen in some ways could be the equivalent of that. You take excess wasted electricity, wind farms that are generating more than the capacity for the grid, you turn that into hydrogen, and when suddenly the wind stops blowing, you go back through a fuel cell or a turbine, you burn the hydrogen, which obviously just gives water, and you can use that as a combustion source with a turbine, generate electricity when you need it on demand. And I think that's really the beauty of natural gas. I mean, that sounds weird, but that's the reason that natural gas is such a great energy source, is that, you produce it out of a well, you put it in a storage facility, and it stays there. You can use it tomorrow, you can use it next week, you can use it next year, doesn't really matter. But as soon as you need electricity, you turn the burners up a bit more, you generate more electricity, and that's why it works so well. So we have to find an alternative type of energy source or energy vector that we would traditionally use natural gas for. And that's really where hydrogen does have an application, maybe in a slightly different way. So instead of just mining it and having it, you generate it, but you store it. And then once you stored it, you can then use it on demand. And that's in some ways the beauty of it.
I suppose the storage of it is actually quite simple, because you just need a big tank. You can even fill up a massive balloon and send it up into the sky and store it in the sky if you really wanted to, I suppose.
Well, you're not old enough. You might be for one of them that was famous. When I was a kid, the UK stored hydrogen on the million tonnage scale every day.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely before me.
Yeah?
That was definitely before my time.
Well, no. Have you ever watched cricket, a test match at the Oval?
Not live, no. I've only ever listened to it on the radio.
Oh, okay. Well, if you ever watched it or you ever went there live, it was famous for having a gasometer at one end. It's not there anymore, but it was always the gasometer end of the pitch, basically. The commentary was always, even on the radio, they'd always talk about that. Well, gasometers were a Victorian invention for storing town gas. Now, town gas, or coal gas, as it came from coal, was the composition of town gas was about 50% hydrogen, and the rest was carbon monoxide and methane. Now, if you've got a mixture of hydrogen, let's say hydrogen and carbon monoxide, in a container, the one that's going to leak is hydrogen, right? Because it's the smallest molecule, lightest molecule. And these gasometers were about the size of an apartment block or a major building. I mean, they were massive, great things. And if you go back through all the records, I've never found, and I don't believe there was ever an accident involving a gasometer. Maybe someone fell off it, or, because these were massive, great cast iron, big iron things. And what they were was basically a vessel that floated on top of itself and used water as the seal. And it was a water seal. And as you put more gas in, the roof of the gasometer went up. And then the gas was used, it went down. And it was only stored at a few bar. It was above atmospheric because it was the weight of the steel that held the thing in. And they were a perfect system for storing hydrogen because they did. It's just they stored it with carbon monoxide, which the proof that it didn't leak is it didn't kill everyone who was around the area, because if the carbon monoxide leaked, everyone who lived around one would have been killed. But that approach could be used. Now, there was a bit of not in my backyard with gasometers, because I grew up in Farnham in Surrey, and the town next door is Aldershot in Hampshire. And Aldershot's where the headquarters of the army is. It's a blue-collar town, should we say, compared to Farnham, which is a commuter town. Farnham didn't have a gasometer. Aldershot had two of them. And so there was a social economic issue about the location of gasometers. However, we do have in the UK an enormous amount of old brownfield sites. We have sites that are old quarries that are disused. All of these could be used for storage. So the storage of hydrogen, if not at pressure, but at low pressure, is actually not a problem. So if someone had the will and the money, you could do it tomorrow. It wouldn't be the technology's there. It's been around since Victorian times. It worked very well for decades, 100 years. There's no reason why it won't work again. And so I think that there was an issue came out, I think it was today or yesterday, about an article where someone was talking about after the election, irrespective of who wins and everything else, if we're going to adopt green technology and if we're going to move ahead with decarbonization and net zero, whichever government's in needs to rationalize the approach to projects giving green light, whether it's planning permission and other things. And so I think all things like hydrogen storage and generation of hydrogen at clean energy sites are going to be things that have to be tackled that way. We have to rationalize how we approach these things. And sometimes people need to understand the better good. I mean, there are people who now don't want wind farms near them, but there's probably the same people who didn't want a nuclear power station, or probably the same people who didn't want a gas power station next to them. So,
I suppose that then comes around to sort of where does the money come to fund projects like that? Because as an investor, I suppose you want some form of security to actually pay for that. As I remember speaking to my brother-in-law, he works for one of the banks in London, that does a lot of basically private investment funds, and they like solar farms at the moment, because you basically rent a field, you put your solar panels up there, it pays off in 2 years, and then you got 18 years of basically profit before you have to decommission.
Yeah.
But again, when you start talking about more sort of things where there's not such an obvious amount of, or obvious route, whether you go in sort of battery storage, hydrogen storage, or any other form of storage, and then you've got government interventions and policies that come in, trying to attract those investors to make a decision to do that becomes a problem as well.
Well, also, you mentioned the issue of investment is that most venture funds or big investment funds are not the brightest intellectual groups on the planet, right? They tend to be a bunch of lemmings to start with, but they're also a group who like simple solutions. So solar farms are easy.
Yeah.
Rent land, buy land, put solar farm on, wait a couple of years, start making money because you have a takeoff agreement, right? As long as the sun shines or the light comes up in the day and the light goes down at night, you're fine, right? There's minimal maintenance. They kind of understand I buy this, I install this, it makes this money. Where they have problems is in things which don't fit into that little model. And so one of the problems, and I actually work with a couple of investment funds to help them and advise them in potential investments. And sometimes it's trying to persuade them that, yes, it's a little unusual, but here's something that has a much bigger potential than your solar farm. And it's part of it is they don't tend to have the technical background to understand why something is good. The downside is they tend to believe stuff that people tell them without questioning it. And of course, there are, especially in the medical space, there are lots of examples. In fact, even in solar, there was a famous one in the States, a company called Cylindra, who thought, you know, the old-fashioned fluorescent light strips, the circular glass strips. What they did was coated a solar panel material, compound semiconductor, on the tube, right? And then they put these tubes, just like an old-fashioned light, a vacuum tube light fitting. They put them with a reflector on the bottom, and they claimed that this was more efficient than a flat solar panel because it meant the sun wasn't just hitting here, but it was hitting and bouncing back. So the whole tube was getting it. Well, it turned out NASA had looked at this for space solar panels back, 10, 15 years before. And NASA had done all the calculations and worked out that no, it was bullshit. Excuse my language, that this was not going to work. I mean, it was more efficient weight-wise, area-wise to have a traditional solar panel. Right? However, Cylindra persuaded a bunch of investors to put up something like 50 million. They persuaded, or maybe even more, they persuaded the Obama administration to give them another 100 million. And I think they ended up burning through a couple of 100 million before everyone realized that it didn't work. And these investors thought it was a good idea because the company said, oh, look, this is a really good idea. But no one of the investors looked at it and went, I wonder if we should ask an expert. Let's ask some people who may have done this already. And if they bothered calling up NASA, NASA would have said, save your money. And these in pension funds and everything wouldn't have lost, several hundred million. And the US government and the taxpayer had to cough up the rest. And I think that's the other problem is, again, it's a bandwagon thing. They're a bit like governments and offshore wind and so on. People think of one thing and then it doesn't matter what the evidence is. They just jump on it as being a solution. And so I think that's the other problem with green technology, decarbonization, sequestration, capture, utilization, all these different things, is the people who are either in government making the decisions or policy or financial institutions don't have the technical knowledge to assess the process and make an informed decision on the funding. They kind of do it. It's like, oh, it's great. They're sequestering CO2. It must be good. Oh, this must be great. I'll put my money in. And then realize it doesn't do anything. Yeah.
I suppose, going back to like the sort of academic side, I think part of that comes from the claims being made there. It's like, if you read any paper, like, I hate this word impact when, you apply for a grant and they go, what impact will this have? And like, as a pure scientist, you go, who cares? It's really cool. We're going to find something interesting out of it. But
the other problem is that the vast majority of papers And this is how I got into starting my first company and changing how I approached research. Was most papers start off with there is much interest in carbon nanotubes, or whatever the phrase is. There is much interest, and then they write and that this could be the solution to, and it's a whole list of things that it could solve. Yeah. But if you go and look at the references, it's some bizarre paper which says maybe in 1,000 years it could be used for this or whatever, And then that's their justification for doing the research or for getting the grant or anything else. And then they publish a paper which doesn't mention any of those applications, doesn't solve any of those applications, doesn't provide any data that helps them. And academics are horrible at doing this, of trying to justify why they're publishing a paper that has little or no benefit to mankind, is really just a piece of cool chemistry or whatever, science or physics, but they end up trying to justify. There's a journal called Angewandte Chemie, which is a Anglo-German chemistry journal by Wiley, and they were famous back in the 80s and early 90s for publishing really beautiful molecules. It's a lot of inorganic chemistry, and you'd publish a paper, and it wouldn't start out of there is much interest in blah blah blah. It would just start out by saying, no one's ever made a molecule shaped like a mushroom before, or whatever it is, shaped like whatever. And hey, we made it. Isn't that cool? And chemists will look at it and go, wow, that's really cool. It has no use, but it's really cool. But everyone knew that it was a useless, other than intellectually useful, but it was a useless molecule. But it was just one that everyone looked at and went, it's almost like a piece of art, right? That changed in the 90s to where everyone had to justify why they were doing whatever they were doing. In doing so, you kind of put on an air that what you're doing solves the problem. And I noticed recently BBC News in their science division has become very lazy journalistically. And so people publish papers saying, oh, we're going to turn plastic into hydrogen. And immediately there's a headline talking about plastic to hydrogen. You go and read the actual paper, and they've made a microgram of hydrogen, and it took them 6 weeks. And, it's so low on the TRL that it's never really going to get anywhere. But the BBC has just taken it as stated that this is a great advance, So one of the things that I did back in the early 90s was one of the ways I got into nano, and this is a weird way, we were looking at growing thin films of materials. And there was a lot of people who were saying, oh yeah, I've made this molecule and it contains these two elements. It contains gallium and arsenic, and I grow films of gallium arsenide. But gallium arsenide you can grow by taking a molecule of gallium and a molecule of arsenic, and it'll still grow gallium arsenide because gallium arsenide is a thermodynamic sink. So anything grows gallium arsenide, right? But there was this proposal that people had made that if you made a molecule with a certain shape, that would control the structure of the thin film. But no one had ever proven it. And the reason they hadn't is they always had molecules that look like the thermodynamic phase. Well, as I say, you could take one molecule and make the thermodynamic phase, or take two molecules and make thermodynamic. Didn't make any difference. So we'd come up with a class of molecules that were cubic. They were cubanes. They were 4 galliums, 4 sulfurs, or 4 indiums, 4 sulfurs, or 4 galliums, 4 seleniums. But it was a cube. And the cube was incredibly stable. So when you did the mass spec, it lost all the organic substituents, and you were left with this cube. You couldn't break it. It was like, it just was so rigid. So then we found we could grow a thin film of it. And the thin film structure was not the thermodynamic phase. In fact, it was a metastable phase that had never been seen before. It was a cubic phase of gallium sulfide, which shouldn't occur if you just look at what the structure should be. So we made something that was not thermodynamically stable, but we made it because the molecule had the shape. And so there was that proof that a molecule could define the structure of a solid material. Okay, at that point, we could have just said, well, that's kind of cool. It's very pretty. But we actually measured the properties of that film, and it turned out to be a very wide bandgap semiconductor. Well, that's interesting. Then what we realized is it was lattice matched to gallium arsenide. So it actually had the same structure as gallium arsenide. And one of the things in the electronics industry is silicon. The reason silicon is such a ubiquitous semiconductor is that the surface of a semiconductor has what are called dangling bonds, interfacial states. It's rubbish. So you have to grow something on top, which in the case of silicon is silicon dioxide. And that's why Intel's Intel is they were the first people to learn how to do it properly. And that's what's called passivates the silicon. And that means your chip actually works. Well, gallium arsenide at the time, the only chips that we used were in Cray computers. And one of the problems was no one had a good way of passivating gallium arsenide. Why was that important? Well, your cell phone works with a gallium arsenide chip. The microwave emitter chip that's in all cell phones is a gallium arsenide chip. The laser diode that's in CD players or DVD players, whatever, is gallium arsenide. So in order to get that to work, they had to work out how to passivate. And there were several different approaches. Well, we worked out that ours looked like it did it. So the next thing we did was we went off and made layers and made electronic measurements, electronic measurements, fluorescence measurements. We did everything to prove that it was doing what it was doing. Again, academically very nice, could be in a physics textbook. That's very pretty. But then we said, well, wait a minute. In that case, let's make a transistor. So we went and made the first of a new style of transistor and published that and said, hey, we made a transistor. And it was part of that process of, if you start something and say, oh, I'm doing this because I'm going to cure cancer, well, then cure cancer. If you're starting this to say, I'm going to do this to convert CO2 into something useful, well, then do it. Go through all the steps and keep going. And we ended up starting a company. We sold the company to a company called Triquint, who actually was the fab that made the Cray computer chips and microwave emitter chips. Now, the technology that we developed isn't in your cell phone, but a great-great-granddaughter of that technology is in your cell phone. It's a way of saying it, right? And so there's an example where very few academics will take it to the next step and the next step and the next step. And the reason they don't is we started doing chemistry, which was my background, making molecules. We then started doing material science, which wasn't my background, even though I'm also a professor of material science now, but it wasn't my background. So I'm out of my comfort zone, but I brought in postdocs who knew what they were doing. That then led us to electrical engineering, which again is way out of my comfort zone. Right? That led us to a semiconductor device fabrication, and again, way out of what my normal academic comfort zone is. And I think that's the reason that people don't do that process, is they get worried that as they come out of their comfort zone, either, and my approach is, I learned something. I learned a hell of a lot about the semiconductor industry and transistor design and manufacturing and everything else. You also got to interact with people who are very smart. Yep. And I think there is a risk to all of that most academics don't go in. And that's why you tend to have academic research that either doesn't go anywhere, or it's really cool and they gets put on a shelf, or never really does anything, because in order to someone has to take it to that next step, and then the next step and the next step. And it's really difficult even if you come up with something cool, for someone else to come in and take it. Yeah. It needs to be that group of people, and that you bring in other people into the process.
Yeah, that's what else thing you would have done then, is you'd have started learning about business operations as well. When you started
everything. I mean, and that's, I'd done a court case as an expert witness, and I knew a little bit about IP, but that taught me a lot about patent process and patent IP licensing, negotiations with major corporations. You keep learning all that experience. And every time I've subsequently taken something and commercialized it, it's always been because you take it to the next step, because you take it to the next thing, because you do the next thing. So the other example was started out as a paper that was published by a group of Russians back in the 70s, where they claimed they made an aluminium analog of a siloxane polymer. So a siloxane polymer is oxygen, silicon, oxygen, silicon, oxygen, silicon. Each silicon has two alkyl substituents on. We call it silicon grease or silicone that caulking compound or anything else. Right? They claimed they made the aluminium analog, which would be oxygen, aluminium with one substituent, oxygen, aluminium, one substituent. And the problem with that is any GCSE chemist would tell you that it's not an octet, it's not electronically complete, and so it shouldn't be stable. But these Russians have published this. Well, the US Navy approached me and said, hey, we saw this paper and it claims all these properties for this polymer and we're really interested, and you do aluminium chemistry, so could you, we'll fund you to do this. Okay, fine. Well, within a year, we'd worked out they actually weren't polymers at all. What they were was something no one had heard of in those days, nanoparticles. So they were nanoparticles of little pieces of a mineral called boehmite with organic substituents around, right? And so I had to go back to the US Navy and say, do you want the good news or the bad news? And the good news is we've worked out what the structure of these things are. We know how to change the properties and we know how to do this. Great. What's the bad news? They're not polymers. Now, the reason that was the bad news is we were funded by the Office of Naval Research Polymer Division. But luckily, the guy who was in charge liked what we'd done and carried on funding us. But what we did was we then said, well, how do we make these not the way they've been made previously? Because it was a very laborious hit and miss process. And so we worked out how to make these particles directly. We worked out how to functionalize, and we worked out how to change their properties, how to do all sorts of stuff with them. That led us to learning how to make surfaces, changing the functionality of a surface to superhydrophilic, superhydrophobic. We'd done it on particles, so we did it on surfaces, so flat alumina substrates. So we could make substrates that were either superhydrophilic or superhydrophobic. We then worked out that if we made filters, alumina-based filters and membranes, we could change the rate at which water went through the membrane, or we could change the rejection characteristics of the membrane. From that, we actually made large-scale membranes and worked out how to change the properties. From that, we worked out that we could separate hydrocarbons from water, or bacterial organics from water, and that we worked out the mechanism of that. From that, we then went and built a unit that was in a 40-foot container that we put in the field and took to an oil field, and removed and separated oil from produced water and gave them back clean water. That subsequently became a company we started in Qatar that's commercially cleaning produced water and essentially, instead of having wastewater that's contaminated, providing clean water and then extracting the hydrocarbon. And all of that came from a project that was just looking at whether something was a polymer or not. But it's the process of always doing the next thing.
Yeah, it's always trying to complete the work. It's kind of something that you should tell to like people tell to PhD students. Just because the experiment that you think you're doing doesn't give the results you want, complete your other analysis and other techniques on it, because it might lead you somewhere else into the new discovery. And
the other thing is that one thing was my very first PhD student, a guy called Matt Healy. He came from MIT. He was an undergraduate at MIT. Joined my group, and he wanted to do some aluminium organometallic chemistry. And there was a molecule that had been made, which was an aluminium with a methyl group, and then two BHTs, butylated hydroxytoluene. It's a big organic ligand, right? It's in cornflakes. It's a food additive. But anyway, some people had made this molecule, and it was kind of an interesting molecule. And I said to him, wow, I wonder if we can put 3 of those around aluminium, because they're so big. It'd be really cool. So he spent 4 years of his PhD, published 12, 13 papers in things like Journal of American Chemical Society, Organometallics, really good journals. And at the end of the 4 years, he actually ended up making the molecule I'd asked him to make at the first place. And it turned out it was useless. It was so inert, you could leave it in air and it didn't do anything. You could heat it up and it didn't do anything. It was very pretty. We published it in Angevante Chemie. It was very pretty, but it just was useless, right? But in the meantime, because he'd failed at doing what we were trying to do, but he got other interesting results on the way, he'd ended up with this massive swath of research that was really cutting edge and completely changed how people thought about aluminium chemistry, and opened up all new areas, and people are still referencing that work and still publishing stuff that related to it even now. But the important point was the goal we'd set out turned out to be really boring. But everything that happened on the way was really interesting. And I think that gets back to your comment about what you need to say to researchers is, just because you've got a goal in mind, that may be not the most interesting thing you're going to do.
No.
But you need to take things when they happen and run with them.
Yeah.
So.
And I suppose it also comes down to like the idea of you don't want people like to have like a headline figure. So Oxford PV have just released a tandem solar cell of perovskite, and I think it's silicon base. And the media have got hold of that and said it's 45 or 47% efficient, which is the highest that the perovskite has reached so far. The fact that it's the size of a 5p piece is not going to be doesn't get mentioned, but it's also along the lines of being 47% efficient for a solar cell isn't actually that important, because unless you are really limited for space and you need to eke out for every meter squared as much energy as you can, what's more important is how long it will last, what its longevity is, how cheap is it to make, and also I found I've got solar panels on my roof. In days when it comes to July, they're less efficient just because they're so hot, so they lose about 10 or 15% of their efficiency. So what do you actually want? Or in sort of January time, in sort of just cloud cover, they're not producing a huge amount. So you want solar panels that turn on at a low light exposure, cheap to make, and last for ages. And ideally, when you come to recycle them, if they do need to be recycled,
easy to deal with.
Yeah, it's clean to do, and that's the bit that the article totally missed. But because they're told to be 47% efficient, which if you then compare to a meter by 2 meter silicon panel, which is 22% efficient, it sounds impressive, but it's not comparing like with like.
Well, the only people who really care about efficiency are NASA, right? Or satellite makers. And that's only because of weight. It costs you to put something up in space. It's a weight issue. And that's why all of solar panels that are on International Space Station and things like that are 3.5 semiconductor cascade cells. And those can reach 40% efficiency. But they're really expensive to make. But their efficiency is such that the panel you take up in space is this big, not this big. And that's worth several $1 million. Because that's how much it costs to put up the extra weight that you're going to put up in space. And you're right. I see this so often as people say, oh, I've got a perovskite cell. It's, 30% efficient, whatever percent efficient. Yeah, it's 30% efficient for maybe 10 minutes. Or if you're really lucky, for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, until it rains.
Until it rains, or it gets badly oxidized, or, whatever else has happened. But, you can go and buy solar panels that are, a meter by a meter size. And, it ranges from, say, 16 to 22%, depending on the price. Because the solar cells are all matched to be roughly the same efficiency to make a panel of whatever efficiency. You can buy that. It'll run for 20 years, maybe more. The efficiency does decay with time. There is some changes. But as you say, if you wanted to recycle it, the glass is easier to take off and reuse. The wafers, in theory, you can reuse for other things. A lot of it can be redone. And so until I've always said with the perovskites, until someone's made a meter by meter panel and has put it on the roof of a house in Swansea where it rains all the time. And you're right, in the summer, Swansea's probably about the best place for solar. Sounds weird. We have daylight, long daylight. The temperatures in the summer aren't too high, because when they are too high, you get inversion of the electronic states, and therefore you don't have efficiencies in solar panels. So that is a problem. So the Middle East is great for the amount of sunlight, but not for the temperature. Swansea's not so good for the amount of sunlight, but it's much better for the temperature. So your panel is probably more efficient more of the time here than it is in Saudi Arabia or in Spain, right? And so what you want is you just want to have a panel that will work for a long time. You want to put it on your roof, or you want to put it in a solar farm, and you just want to leave it.
Yeah.
And until someone's done that, I'm afraid it tends to be a lot of PR. It tends to be a lot of academics trying to say how, I've cured the future of clean energy. And they don't ask, and that's also the problem with a lot of journalists. They're very lazy. They don't ask the important questions. And I can remember when ProfSkype first came out, there was articles, and I actually got asked to quote on one. And it was an article that came out in Science, and Wall Street Journal and various other people were all up in arms about, this is the future of solar. And I went back and read the paper, and I got interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, and they said, this is a future, blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, no, not really. And they were like, what? And I said, well, have you read the paper? No. Well, if you read the paper, the little wafer they made, which again was about the size of a US quarter, I think at the time, was X efficiency for 5 minutes. And after 5 minutes, it didn't work. I said, so you're going to buy a solar panel every 5 minutes?
Yeah.
And this poor journalist looked at me like, you've just ruined my story. And I said, I guarantee you're not going to quote me, are you? Because it ruins your story. He said, no, I am going to quote you because it's it's good journalism. And I said, yes, but this is the thing you need to do, is you need to question what's put in front of you, and then ask the questions of the people that may not be the polite questions, but they're the ones that need to be asked. So that, yes, it's a great story. Someone's made a new style of solar cell, but here are all the challenges.
Yeah,
this is what will have to happen before it works.
Yeah,
it's the same way as saying I've got a new drug that cures some form of cancer. The end of the article then needs to go on this has only been done on rats. It then needs to be done on monkeys. It then needs to be done on people. It then needs to go through FDA approval. It then needs to do this. Don't expect this to be used on people for at least 10 years. It needs to state that, because otherwise people get they see a solution to something, and then when it doesn't happen, they get upset that they think that whoever it is has failed, and I think that's really important. We need to be more realistic about how long it takes, what's the real success, and what's the benefit.
Yeah, it's one of those things, like throughout the past 30 years, you've had sort of miracle materials. So carbon nanotubes, 1991, they were first discovered. 2002, graphene. It's only just now that the carbon nanotubes are starting to actually be used in devices that you see every day, whether that be something like just a bike frame or tennis racket, through to light bulbs,
batteries,
batteries and whatever. So it's that idea of time. I think people want this. I think it's even getting worse now, that people want this sort of instant solution, but research takes a huge amount of time. Just even writing a grant takes 6 months to 9 months just to go from you coming up with an idea to it being submitted, and then you have to wait 3 more months until the panel goes through it. Yep. And then you've got another 3 months legitimacy, and then suddenly you've got 2 years from just having maybe an initial idea to actually being able to take it to the next research stage, let alone bring it up.
Well, actually, graphene's a good example. Is that was discovered, although it was known for years beforehand. Because thin layer of graphene sheets were known. They just weren't called graphene. And so suddenly it became the hot topic, and Manchester University invested and built an entire center that was focused on graphene, which is kind of like having a solution and trying to find problems to attach to it, which I think is always the wrong way around going around anything. Now, I've got the solution and now I'm going to force it into whatever. I've got a square peg and I'm going to force it into whatever hole, no matter what size shape the hole is. But it's interesting. The very first semiconductor device that contains graphene has only just hit the market. And bizarrely, the guy who's leading it is one of my former postdocs, who was the guy that did the gallium arsenide transistor and went to work for the company, my company, and then the company we sold my company to. He's now back in the UK running the facility that makes the very first graphene-based semiconductor device.
So that means it must have a double layer piece of graphene then.
Yes, it's a multi-layered graphene device, but it's the only one. Yeah. And it's taken them 10, 15 years to get on to a device, just in the same way that there was a company called Nantaro that commercialized carbon nanotube memory devices, but mainly for the Defense Department in the US. It took them 10, 15 years to do it. And they're still producing devices. It's a very limited market. They're memory chips that don't require a constant voltage to remember the memory. So, most memory chips, you 1 zeros. The chip has to always be powered for it to know that it's a 1 or a 0.
Yeah.
Their devices don't. It's 2 carbon nanotubes that sit opposite each other like this. And when you put a charge on it, the 2 tubes touch each other and short circuit. And they never come apart until you reverse bias it.
So it's using the mechanical properties then to...
Yeah, it uses, but basically it's a zero energy storage for memory. And that's why it's used by defense contractors. But it's interesting that it has taken this long for all these things to develop. But at the time, everyone stands up and talks about, oh, this is the best thing ever. And I will say that we were involved in a project called Flexus, which was out of Cardiff University, Swansea, and University of South Wales. And it was supposed to look at alternative energy and green energy systems and everything else. And we had a start meeting with various politicians. We had an international kickoff. We had another announcement. There was probably 6 events at the beginning of the project saying how it was going to solve every problem. At the end of the 6 years, 7 years, they hadn't solved anything. But at the beginning, they just spent all the time with a bunch of politicians saying how it was going to solve this problem and it was going to be the first of this and the first of that. So when we started what was called the RICE project, which was reducing industrial carbon emissions, and it was funded by the same group that funded Flexus, and our goal was to do industrial demonstration and something I'll come back to, which was called TRL jumping. And it was a way of getting things to commercial market very quickly. And we didn't have any announcement. We didn't do any big launch. We didn't do anything with politicians. We just started doing the projects, and Dan was involved. We built green hydrogen. We installed it at a cement plant. We built the biggest algae biorefinery with downstream processing in the UK. It's now running as a commercial entity. We put in the first PSA system at an industrial site to be able to allow different processes. So we did all this, and the first time we had a big event was right as the project was finishing. And that event was to tell everyone all the success, everything that had been successful. And obviously we didn't talk about anything that wasn't successful, but we only talked about what we'd actually done, not what we said we were going to do. And part of this comes from when I was first a professor at Harvard. It was about the 2nd or 3rd paper I published. And it was an interesting molecule. No one had ever made a molecule of this type before. We characterized it completely. And it turned out a lot of people, not a lot, but there were several people, this was before the internet, before Twitter and everything, who were writing articles claiming that it wasn't right or that there was something wrong with it. It was kind of weird. Other people then went and replicated it and proved that we were right. But there were several articles in journals saying that it wasn't possible, or, and I was actually, as a young academic, I'm 24 as a professor, and I was kind of upset because there was all these people saying nasty things about me, So I went and saw the chairman of the department, who was a bit of a obnoxious guy, but I actually got on with him very well, a guy called George Whitesides. And I went and said, George, we published this paper. And he said, yeah, I saw that. Interesting molecule. Nice. And I said, yeah, but these guys have just written these letters to Chemical Engineering News saying that it's not right, and blah, blah, blah. This NMR shift can't be true. And I said, I'm feeling kind of depressed, because we've redone it and we know it's right. But all these people are basically saying nasty things about me. And he said, well, you know what? You're never as good as when you haven't done anything. And what he meant by that was, these are all the people who hadn't done this, and therefore they were criticizing it. Whereas I'd actually gone and done something, so now people could criticize me. So you can only be criticized when you've actually achieved something, or you did or didn't do something. But when you've actually got that far, people can then criticize you and say, oh, well, it's not big enough, or it's not red enough, or it's not blue enough, or whatever it is, right? But if you stand up before you've done anything and saying, I'm going to cure cancer, I'm going to solve clean energy, I'm going to sequester all the carbon in the atmosphere, no one can criticize you because you haven't done it. And I think there's a lot of that goes on where people claim they're going to do X, Y, Z, but because they've never got to that point, no one can actually criticize you. No. We started the RICE project, and we were already replacing not enormous amounts of natural gas with hydrogen, but it was significant. And I was giving a talk at a conference, which was an environmental conference. And there was a lot of environmental activists at this workshop conference. And I said, well, we produce green hydrogen, we replace natural gas at this cement plant, and blah, blah, blah. And they said, well, how much are you replacing? And I said, oh, probably 1 or 2%. Well, that's not much, is it? And I was feeling in a rather obnoxious mood. So I turned around and said, how much carbon have you sequestered or captured today? And, meaning, well, at least I've done something. It may be only this much, but I've done more than you. I've done this much more than you. And I think that's something that we have to get over. You can only really be judged on your achievements. And there are a lot of people who go around objecting to something or protesting something or saying that we shouldn't do something, but they never have a solution of their own. Yeah. And they don't do anything to get to that goal. It's a bit like the Just Stop Oil guys who went and vandalized
Yeah.
I guarantee they got there in a car.
Yeah.
And even if they say, oh, it was an EV, well, yeah, but you charged it at home, and 50% or whatever of electricity in Britain comes from hydrocarbon fuels, so you're still not green. But you just managed to kill a bunch of lichen on a couple of 1,000-year-old piece of stone.
Yeah, I was watching January Vines, the Channel 5 sort of discussion program. That's on in the morning show in the UK, and they had one of the leaders of Just Stop Oil there, and his justification was, oh, but we need to raise awareness of climate change. So most people already know. There's already a lot of work being done into it. Do more work, actually support that work, and actually find the solution.
Well, it's a bit like if you go to, I was giving a talk to a group of school children who were they were about to do their GCSEs next year, I guess. It was at the chemistry department at Swansea. And I was talking about some of our projects and net zero. And the questions they asked were actually very insightful questions. And these are all 15, 16-year-olds. They understand climate change. They may not understand the minutia of the process, but they understand it's real. They understand we have to do something. They want to get involved. There are a lot of questions about, well, is this a complete solution? How can I get involved in working with projects like this? You know, things like this. Clearly, if these school kids understand it, then raising awareness is a bit late.
Yeah.
If people are already aware, they know it happens. We're all having to deal with it. Everyone's discussing it. There's posters everywhere, you know, and so I actually find that argument kind of disingenuous. That, you know, I think the general British public and Europe in general, let's say, are much more in tune with this is a problem. This is the future that we have to deal with. You know, there are other countries around the globe. There are some who a lot of the population don't believe in it, like in the US. But there are other countries where everyone really does believe in it because the water level's gone up and their country's getting smaller, you know. And there's even, where was it? There's an island that's just been evacuated because climate change is causing it to the flooding on this small island. And there was, I don't know, several hundred people, I think, who had to be moved. Well, they understand climate change because they've just been moved, you know. So I think that's something that we all have that as a target. And I think that we need to, I mean, Nike, you know, have their catchphrase,
just do it, yeah.
Which I think is almost the catchphrase for climate change, is just go and do it. You may not solve it yourself, but every little piece will get us there. So if, you know, one company does this and another company does that and another group does this and another group does that, and you just do a little piece here and there, you'd be surprised that at the end of 10, 20 years, you've actually achieved it.
You know, that's the Dave Braceford idea, isn't it? Marginal gains.
Yeah.
Take a little, improve every little bit, a little small amount, and over time it amounts up to a big effect. This is
it's like, you know, I've raced cars, my picture behind me, and I would say, other than age and weight, the difference between me and Lewis Hamilton is milliseconds. It's on a lap of a racetrack. He brakes 1/10 of a second later at that point. He's on the accelerator a 1/10 of a second earlier. And you do that all the way around, and it's all tenths of seconds and milliseconds. That adds up to the difference between a Formula One driver and me. But it's the same thing with trying to overcome to get to net zero, climate change. It's not about just being the best. It's about doing a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, a little bit there, and then you do something and someone else does something, and suddenly the UK is at net zero before it actually realized it, as opposed to trying to worry about a single solution. We're getting back to this whole thing of there isn't a single solution. Everyone needs to do something different, you know. And this group of school children, one of the questions that they asked, which was actually really smart, was how can I help achieve net zero? And so we talked about, you know, reducing waste. And they said, well, why? And I said, okay, so if you throw away food, the Swansea Council collects it and it gets landfilled predominantly. That landfilled food goes through anaerobic digestion. It generates methane. Methane's an even worse greenhouse gas than CO2. So the fact you didn't eat your vegetables contributes to greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
And I said, so if you only buy, produce, and cook and eat the food you need, not only will you save yourself a fortune, but you are actually impacting net zero. So there's something that you as an individual can do. Oh, you know.
I made a video. Was it last month or the month before? And it was basically it was just me sort of just having this conversation with myself about what it was after Labour said they're going to cut their 28 billion commitment, and it was basically the video was what Keir Starmer could do to not spend 28 billion, but still have an impact. And it could be just simple things like on a government or local government area, like if you're building a house, orientate the roof so it's north-south, so you can put your solar panels on it. It doesn't cost anything. There's like heat pumps in Wales. If you have to put in Wales, for some reason, we have this rule that if you want to have a heat pump, if it's within 3 meters of a boundary,
Right.
you have to apply for planning permission. In England, it's 1 meter and it's about to be reduced. Like, why don't we just go on the policy and just delete the 3 and put 0.5?
Yes.
It makes things so much easier.
And it is exactly right. We live in a townhouse, and it's a 4-story townhome, but the roof goes east-west. The townhomes down from us go north-south. They've all got solar panels on.
Yeah.
It's pretty much a waste of time us putting solar panels, because you'd have to put it on both sides. And even then, yes, in the morning and in the evening, you get electricity from both. But in terms of efficiency, it's not particularly efficient. And you're exactly right. Just make it planning permission. You build a house, there has to be a roof facing south. End of story. Doesn't matter anything. And that means that the owner can then decide whether to put solar on, or the contractor, or the developer. But if you just make that a regulation, you have a fantastic change in the ability to put solar, or whether it's PV or solar thermal onto houses. There are little changes. I mean, one of the critical ones, one of the good examples of it is, Wales was the first place to charge for plastic carrier bags.
Yeah.
And you go into Tesco's down the road, or Sainsbury's. How many times do you actually see anyone these days buy a carrier bag?
Yeah.
Everyone brings them with them, or they just walk out like this, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to carry all this stuff because I'm not paying the 5p or 10p or whatever it is these days to buy a plastic bag, right? But it fundamentally changed how we behave.
Yeah. And initially there's outrage at it.
Oh, yeah.
But then you also get to the point then when you get to, like, if you go into Lidl's, you go, I'm just going to go in to buy a bunch of bananas and a loaf of bread, and you end up going to the middle aisle and you end up coming up with, an arc weld or something like that.
Yeah.
And you don't have enough, you go, oh, damn, I've left my bag at home, but I'm still not going to spend 5p to carry this stuff alongside the arc welder.
And it's funny, the day they instigated in England, my wife Mary and I were traveling into England, something, I don't remember where we were going now, and we got over the border and we went to one of the service stations to fill up with petrol, and said, oh, we've got a long journey, let's get a sandwich and a drink or whatever. So we go into the Waitrose, I think it was, in the service area, and we get a sandwich and a bag of chips and crisps and a drink, and we go up to the counter, and the guy behind the counter goes, you don't want a bag, do you? Because I have to charge you. It's obviously, this has been a sore point all day.
Yeah.
And Mary opens up her purse that's big enough, just throws everything and goes, oh, no. And I said, we live in Wales. And he goes, thank God for that. He said, you're the first person who hasn't moaned about this. And I said, no, we've been doing it for years. They'll get over it eventually. But it was so funny because he was getting the brunt of everyone's anger over this, And then as soon as he had a customer who just took it for granted, like, oh, yeah, we do this all the time. It's not a big deal, But now, of course, it's become inherent that everyone deals with it.
Yeah, carries a bag around with them.
But the funny thing was, when they switched the law in England, within a year, the downside of it was there was a company that made plastic bags that went out of business because there wasn't demand for plastic bags. Well, that's sad because people lost their jobs, the company went out, et cetera, et cetera. But that shows you what the impact of plastic waste we were having. There was an entire factory. All it did was make plastic carrier bags. Didn't have to make plastic carrier bags anymore. Right?
I was in Bremen at the beginning of the month, and they've got the bottle recycling scheme there. So if you buy, like your litre bottle of milk in plastic, it's an extra 10 cents on it, I think it is. It made trying to work out how much anything is going to cost you when you went on the supermarket. It's on metal cans as well. So they go, right, my German's not great, so I don't particularly want to try and hear what the cashier was saying in quick German to try and work out how much is going to go through. So I was trying to work out beforehand, and it was always like sort of 20 cents less than or more than what I was expecting. But it's a brilliant system because you just see people go in there in the morning with they carry a bag full of plastic things, putting it through this return thing. And also, what we found was if you gone into a shop and you bought, like a 500 ml bottle of Coke, probably should say other brands are available, but what they would do is if they were then passing the bin, instead of leaving it, putting it in the bin, they would leave it by the side because then the city's homeless would go around, pick it up, and take it to the recycling place and get their 10 cents back.
When I lived in Boston or in Massachusetts, New York, Vermont, Ohio, Pennsylvania, I think, have a deal when you buy a can of Coke or Pepsi or whatever, there's 5 cents of that which you can get back if you return it to either the stores. So the stores have big things, you just throw it in and it counts the thing and spits out change to you or gives you a dollar bill or whatever. Or you can actually take it to recycling centers in big bags and and they weigh it, and it's just based on weight, and they know that's 200 cans or whatever it is. So first of all, yes, it's useful. You drink the Coke and you just have a whole load. My research group, several of them used to drink Mountain Dew, which is like sugar in a can, or Coca-Cola or whatever in the lab. And we'd have a bin and they just throw in the cans. And then every couple of months, we take that bin and whoever had a car that would fit in, we would go to the recycling center and just dump it, and it would get weighed and we'd get cash. And then the group would have a lunch. We'd use that to have a group lunch or a group dinner. Well, the other thing was the city of Cambridge in Massachusetts would give you these green like bin things that you put the cans in, right? So you put them out on the sidewalk, the pavement at night, like we put our food in the green bags and the pink bags and everything else here. Well, by the time the recycling turned up, they were empty. And the reason is the homeless people would take a shopping trolley and they'd walk around and they'd just throw in all the cans. They go to the local grocery store and just walk in with this thing of cans. And the grocery store would just say, there's the machine. And this homeless person would sit there putting in cans and it would spit out 5 cents a can. And as you said, okay, so I didn't recycle it, someone else did. But it really made a great incentive. Now, Germany's had that for years. When I lived in Göttingen back in the 90s, you bought a bottle of Coke or whatever at a machine. It was glass. And when you finished it, there was a hole on the side of the machine. You threw it in, and it gave you so many pfennigs. And those, it was for Europe, gave you so many pfennigs back. And so it was the incentive to recycle. And I think part of it is we need to be more aware of how we can do things like that and be involved. Mary and I stayed at a hotel in London that doesn't put bottled water in the room. Right. What they do is in the corridor, they have bottles which are reusable bottles. So you take one, and they have a really nice ice cold water machine there. And, you go up, you fill your bottle, you use it, you go back, you fill your bottle, and they even let you take your bottle because the principle is that you'll then recycle it, Now, the downside of all this type of approach, I actually know someone who does a lot of the green recycling for major concert tours. And they were doing for U2 a tour. And they decided, the disposable cups that are always at events, they wanted to do it so that people would recycle them. But they made a mistake. They put the logo of the tour on the cup.
Oh, that's
They made them to be reusable. So they would go and take them I think they were even washable. So they would just get reused and for the next concert venue, in other words, they took them around. The problem was everyone took them home with them because it had this logo on. So now what they do, and I think he's just doing the Billie Eilish's tour, the cups are made as ugly as possible, so people don't want to take them home, right? But they're reusable, so they actually take them and en masse clean them and reuse them for the next concert. So, but they had to come up with the plan of how to stop people actually wanting to take them home, so.
That's something that's hit me. We went to the Beacon concert hall in Bristol, which used to be Constant Hall.
Okay.
And in there, if you bought a drink at the bar, then they give you like the plastic cups. But when you can return it and you get your 5p back or whatever. And compared to sort of like this Swansea arena where people just go around with big black bags and just chuck in the cups in, seemed like such a better idea.
Well, we were at a convention in Leeds, a conference in Leeds, and the tea and coffee was served in these plastic cups, like you'd imagine. And I went to go and get tea, and I pick up one of the cups, and it was wet inside. And I said to the guy, "Oh, this one must be dirty." He goes, "No, it's just been washed." I'm like, "What?" And he goes, "These are all fully reusable." He said, "When you finish with them, just bring them back and or leave them somewhere. We collect them all every night. We put them all in those big dishwashers. We take them out." He said, "The reason is that's a bit of the water from the dishwasher, But I thought, what a great idea. These are not disposable cups, and they were nice plastic. I mean, they were plastic and some insulation material on the outside. But yeah, he said that, they've been using them for about a year or so, and they recycle like 80% of them. There's a few that are lost due to breakage, and people put them in a bin instead of in the where out to be recycled. But he said that the facility, this conference center at Leeds Armory, has completely changed how they use plates and cups.
Yeah.
And they've gone into washing them. And he said it's probably saved the place a fortune from having to perpetually buy new materials, And I think there is a lot that can be done. For all of these things, we just have to be a bit creative and do something a little different. I mean, the prime example of green industry technology, again, before you were around, was the milk industry.
Yeah.
And the way it worked was they go to the different farms, collect the milk, bring it to a central place. There was one in Alton near where I grew up. They pasteurized the milk and then bottled it at the same facility. And it was glass bottles with little foil caps on. And the milk floats were electric. And so at 4 o'clock in the morning, the milk floats started making their delivery. It was all electric. And these were lead acid batteries, and milk floats were really slow. But you know what? It was stop, start as they went round the town. They finished their delivery. They collected the empty bottles. So they dropped off full ones, collected the empties. They went back to the facility, and then those electric vehicles were charged all through the afternoon and the night, because in those days it took a long time to charge an electric vehicle. The bottles were washed and were probably filled and back being delivered the next day. And in terms of circular economy, it was a fantastic system. Unfortunately, the way milk distribution changed, that went away. But it was the perfect recycling, circular economy.
2 secs, I'll just go grab something. There you go. Where's the camera? There it is.
Oh, there you go. A milk bottle.
Yeah, so I think that sort of idea is coming back. So
but it was interesting because the milk floats could be electric because they were only used from 4 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon or something. I mean, all the milk floats tended to come back by about lunchtime, and therefore it didn't matter that they were charged over a long period of time. It also didn't matter they were slow, because they literally went and stopped at every 6th house or whatever it was, and the guy got out, dropped off the milk, collected the milk, and so on. It was a truly functional system, and it was the perfect use of an EV. It was the perfect use of recycling. I'm sure there were bottles that were broken, and you've got some amount that had to be restored, but the volume of products that was recycled and reused was phenomenal. And some of it is we're going to have to get back to those approaches of doing things. I noticed when we were in where were we the other day? Iceland? No, Belgium. Went into a store in Belgium, and you couldn't buy packages of some produce. you had to bring your own container.
Yeah.
Which I thought was like, wow, fine, because that guarantees you're going to reuse that container. You're going to take it home, you use it, you wash it, you bring it back, and you refill it again. And I think getting us all into that non-disposable world is really important, and all of those things help change how emissions are made, how we use emissions, how we use materials, how we recycle materials, how much waste is produced. I mean, plastic waste is, I think, we'll call it carbon is CO2 is the biggest challenge, but plastic waste is not far behind it.
Yeah.
In terms of the environment.
Yeah, I think on that note, that's pretty much sums up exactly what this podcast is meant to be about, is discussing the problems and all the possible solutions. So that's probably a good point to bring this episode to the end. So thank you, Andrew, for being.
My pleasure.
And sharing the views, sharing the experiences. It's definitely been insightful for me, because, again, as somebody at a much earlier stage of their career, although definitely not going to overtake you becoming a professor by the age of 24. Bear in mind, I'm already 36. But
sorry about that.
Yeah. But so it's one of those things I think everybody needs to sort of just take care of. So I don't know what the audience who watches this is, known from just the general challenge you get, or from the general people who comment on the channel. It's anybody from people who are academic through to just people who are curious, or just people who are looking into getting solar panels. So there's trying to spread that information, I think, is important, and just seeing what comes out of it.
Yeah, no, and anything, if there's any questions or anything, I'm more than happy to help.
I'll put links down below to, you've got a Wikipedia article.
Mm-hmm.
You've also, I'll put a link to your ResearchGate and Google Scholar and all that sort of stuff, link to the ESRI website and your profile on that.
And actually, I'm going to give you a link. There's a YouTube video, which I think people might find interesting. Hopefully when I do the link, it'll just put the link to the YouTube in the chat, and then you can provide that. It's a YouTube video which talks about the concept of integrating multiple technologies and how to get to net zero in a very unconventional way. And so I think that your listeners and readers watchers will be interested in seeing that. I would encourage them to go and look at that.
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll put a link to that in the cards up here, or probably over here somewhere. And I'll put that link at the end of the video. Anyway, so we'll say thank you there, and
thank you very much, and thanks to anyone who's listening.